Hi, I'm Deanna Springer.
And I'm Dana Casey with a fun Stitch It Sisters sewing project and classic time-saving tips by Nancy Zieman.
First, let's take a look at the project we're making today. We'll be sewing our McCall's 7871 knit dress with Nancy Zieman's absolute easiest sewing techniques. We'll be using Ponte knit fabrics with spandex, Pellon Easy Knit interfacing, Clover's Stick and Stitch seam guide, Clover's hot ruler, and size 80 chrome jersey ballpoint sewing machine needles.
Last time we shared how to fit our pattern with Nancy's pivot and slide fitting techniques. Today, I look forward to stitching our knit dress.
The first step in sewing our dress is to pre-wash our fabrics. So wash the knit Ponte fabric like you would when it's a completed garment.
Okay.
So I like to wash it in cold water and hang to dry. I put the work into sewing my garment. I want it to look like new, like the day I made it. So wash your fabric and hang it to dry, and then head to the ironing board. Once it's dry, press it, steam press it, and spray starch it. Use a starch alternative that doesn't cause white flaking, and press your fabric and press out those wrinkles and get it all ready for the sewing process. We'll also be using some interfacing today, and after we prepare our fabrics, we'll cut some interfacing.
Okay.
So we're cutting interfacing strips. It's easy to do. It's in 10 minutes you can cut interfacing strips. And we use the interfacing strips around the neckline and other portions of the pattern. So I like to cut some 3/4 inch crosswise fabric strips of knit interfacing, and also some 1 inch, and those are used in the sleeves, and then 1 1/2 for the hem. So you can go ahead and cut that interfacing, those interfacing strips, and then you're ready to lay out your fabric. So lay out your fabric according to the pattern directions. The pattern includes a layout chart in the instructions, and you can lay out your pattern on the grain and use a 5-in-1 sliding gauge or a tape measure, and make sure all your pattern pieces are on grain. The front and the back are cut on the fold, and the rest of the pieces nest nicely into the dress layout. So Pontes are nice and wide, and it's a convenient, handy guide sheet for cutting out all the pieces. After all the pieces are cut, we need to do some fusing. So we'll head to the ironing board and we'll fuse. We'll fuse that 3/4 inch crosswise fabric strip of easy knit interfacing around the front neckline, on the side inset, along the sides, and on the lower hem. And the hem is fused with the wider, the 1 1/2 inch, the hem of the dress. And we do some fusing to the front. Instead of a V-neck, the back pattern piece has a scoop neckline, a back neckline shape.
Okay, and why is it important that we put on the interfacing?
The interfacing strips stabilizes the fabric. So when we're later stitching, say the neck binding to the neck opening, or stitching the shoulder seam, it stabilizes it. It keeps it from stretching out while you're sewing it.
Oh, okay.
And also when it's a garment too, your seams will hold the shape. And using spandex fabric, it's actually Ponte fabric with spandex, gives it a nice return too, and it will hold its shape. But it's basically for stabilizing those seams, especially when we have a V-cut or an interesting shape like that. And years ago, I learned this classic time-saving tip from my longtime friend Nancy, to use these strips of interfacing in these areas to really make the sewing process easy. And in the 70s, when I started sewing knits in 4-H, there were no spandex lycra content in our knit fabrics. And I remember our 4-H Explorer leader, Mrs. Mays, had a stretch and sew party at her house. So we went to her house, and it was all knits and knit sewing, and they were in kits. That was something we didn't see in the stores. You could buy patterns and then buy fabric. But at that stretch and sew party in the 70s, when I was 10 years old in 4-H, you could buy the pattern and the knit in one. And they even came with cuffs and collars.
Oh, wow.
And those knits did not have the high-tech fabric that we have nowadays with that nice recovery and the beautiful weight. And in the 70s, we thought it was difficult to sew with knits. Not anymore. Not using the right techniques and the right needles, we'll break it down and make it easy for you. So once you've fused your 3/4 inch strips on the back neck, we also fuse it to the back shoulder seam. We didn't do that to the front, and you'll see why later. So we fused it to the top shoulder seams. Again, we fused it to that inset side area and along the lower hem. So we have our 1 inch on the lower hem, very much like the front piece. The back is the same.
Okay.
But we'll come back to the front in a little bit. The back, I wanted to show the back. I like to start sewing the back because you get the idea. You see how the pattern comes together with these triangle insets. And sewing the back first teaches you the method. And you can see it's an easy triangle pattern piece that just sets into the seam. And we need to do a little clipping to set that into the seam. But I wanted to show you how it looks when it's completed. And it's really flat construction, except for at the point. We need to cut a little snip into that V shape.
And that's a beautiful accent.
Right. Instead of the back being a solid piece of fabric, it adds interest. It brings that same design content from the front around to the back. So we'll go back to working on the front of the garment, and you see the welt pocket. I'll pull this up on the board, and you can see that welt pocket. We haven't sewn this side, and that side's completely sewn. It's not pressed yet, but it's sewn. And you can see that you have a pocket on the inside that has a welt accent on the outside. And a welt accent is really a rectangle piece of fabric and so easy to make. Once we prepared the pattern, then we stay stitch. We come around and we stay stitch all the way around the V section and the neck section. The front and the back on the neck and the sides. Make sure you stay stitch, and it's shared. We share that in the pattern, and that helps keep it stable as well.
Okay.
And there are a couple darts in this pattern. One is up at the neckline, and it's an accent dart. And you may think, oh, Deanna, maybe you stitched that inside out, because the dart usually looks like this bust line dart. The bust line dart is stitched the traditional way with the seam allowance on the inside. This is an accent dart. It's for design. It's design purposes. It also makes the garment fit really nicely. So it is functional, but it's also a design element.
Sure.
So once you've transferred all your markings, you'll stitch the darts. And there are 4 darts, 1 on each side of the neckline. You'll mark that. You'll meet that wrong sides together when it's the dart at the neckline. And you'll stitch. You'll head to the sewing machine and you'll stitch that dart.
Okay.
That is easy. You can sew your darts in 10 minutes, just 4 darts. And then we'll stitch the pocket. We'll work on that welt pocket opening. And we'll work on my side here and show how we did that. We need to make a welt pocket for that pocket opening.
Okay.
And I have it here. And this is the welt pocket that will be stitched into the dress. And it's a rectangle of fabric. And the pattern pieces are cut. Simple rectangle pattern pieces, and make sure you also cut an interfacing layer. That keeps the nice welt rectangle shape as you're wearing and enjoying the garment. You take that rectangle and you fuse interfacing to the back. And you can see it's not exactly a rectangle. One side is a little bit angled. And we'll place that right sides together, and we'll stitch that angle seam with that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance.
Okay.
And I have that here. And you can see when we're stitching, it's not exactly a straight stitch. That's a wobble stitch. Another classic time-saving tip from Nancy Zieman: set your machine for a wobble stitch when you're sewing knits. And a wobble stitch is a zigzag stitch, only it's almost a straight stitch. So it's right between the settings of a straight stitch and a zigzag. Just a slight zig and a zag, and that gives a little bit of give. A little bit of give to the seam. And we need to turn this. We'll turn the welt right sides out. And it's nice if you have a point-to-point turner. Clover's point-to-point turner gets in there and really pushes that point out. And then we need to stitch. We need to do some basting stitches to keep these edges together so that it's not moving around on us.
Okay.
So at the sewing machine, we'll baste this closed so that we have a rectangle. So you can see there's still cut edges, which is fine. That will be cut in the seam allowance. And then we have a top stitching row along the top of the pocket where the fold is. And then basting stitches across the bottom. And this is where it gets interesting. This dress has a lot of design to it, but it's super easy to do with just rectangles and flat stitching. So we'll take our Welt Pocket and we'll move it over to where it's going to be stitched into. And you'll use your markings and your dot markings and your clips, and you'll line that up. So I'm lining up my clip marks to where that pocket will be stitched. And we'll do a little stitching with some pins. We'll pin baste it where it would be stitched. And I just stitch right along that edge, that top edge, where it meets the lower side inset. And you'll head to the sewing machine and stitch 5/8 of an inch. And you'll stop and back tack right at 5/8 inch in.
Okay.
And it's all included in the pattern. And the next step is to add a pocket. You can see on your finished Welt Pocket, there's a definite pocket in there.
It's a nice deep pocket for sure.
And when you turn it over, you can really see that pocket shape. So you may wonder, here's the inset, there's the inner pocket. How did we get to that step?
Right.
We'll just break it down for you. The first step is to sew that Welt Pocket into place. The second step is to add that pocket lining. This is the pocket lining, and you put that right over the top of that pocket. And you stitch. You stitch where you just stitched that welt into place, and you'll sew that pocket lining to the assembly. And it's starting to come together because when you stitch that and turn it right sides out, that's the pocket lining. That won't be seen on the outside of the garment. But first we need to clip this. We have to clip that intersection because right now it would make a pucker if we tried to sew that. So we'll get our scissors and we'll clip. And it's easier to see it on this side. We need to clip right at that V point. And we just clip right to that stitching line. And that releases that V seam into a more straight seam. Once that's turned right side out, you'll tuck that pocket in, and it's starting to take shape. Yours won't have puckers in it because yours will be actually stitched. And then I'll just release that to show that a little bit better. There's a seam right there that's holding that in place, but we need to top stitch this now. This is a great opportunity right now before we put the rest of the insert in to do some top stitching. So you'll top stitch that in place, and then we'll flip it over to the wrong side. I'll re-stitch this with my pin to show you the next step. The next step would be to make that pocket assembly. We need to attach a pocket shape to the inset shape. To make that pocket assembly, we'll attach the inset to a pocket. And it naturally just goes together to make a pocket assembly.
Okay.
And you can see it taking shape. Here's the inset, that angled accent, the triangle accent, and then here's the pocket, the other part of the pocket lining. So I'll move those pieces over. And I've just stitched 5/8 of an inch with that wobble stitch. And then we'll turn this over and we'll assemble the pocket and the pocket assembly to the garment. So it'll be turned over and stitched, and then we need to insert the assembly right into that V area. Here, I'll move it over here. There we go. Right into that V assembly. You can see where it naturally wants to go, and there's no confusion because you simply line up the side seams. So the top side seam where the side meets the inset is pinned, and I'm matching the notches too. And we've clipped that notch to release it. And there's my alignment. That's where it will be aligned to. I'm pinning, and then we'll head to the sewing machine. When you get to the bottom of the pocket, you just line up the pocket shape and pin. The pocket shape fits the other pocket lining shape, and it's not attached, it's just pinned, and we'd pin that lower seam too. But we can take a look back at this side that's already stitched, and you can see where I stitch. I start at the top, and I stitch this seam all the way down, and then I go right to the pocket, and I sew around the pocket. It's not attached, it's loose.
Nice.
But you can stitch that seam all the way down and around in one stitching line. We'll turn it back over and we'll finish the pocket with some top stitching, and our sleeve is peeking out there. We'll finish the welt in the pocket with some top stitching. So you'll head back to the sewing machine and you'll stitch, do some top stitching. And I leave the wobble stitch setting on the machine when I'm doing my top stitching. It adds a nice decorative accent, and you want to press as you go. So I've top stitched through all layers, all the way around that V accent. And then you don't want to top stitch your pocket shut, so you just top stitch it along that short edge. And because we've top stitched this previously, it's ready to go. I pick up where I left off and I top stitch the rest. And then you'd want to head to the pressing board, and there's a few layers here going on. So you want to steam and press using a press cloth, and then to compact or to flatten your seams, we like to use the tailor's clapper.
One of my favorite tools for sure.
Right. Whether you're sewing or quilting, the tailor's clapper helps open seams or flatten seams. So just press. You just press down after you do some steam pressing, and that will be nice and flat. Be sure to use a press cloth with your knits. You don't want to direct contact with your knits. If you wouldn't put your iron directly on your finished garment, you use a press cloth while you're making it too. And that's the front. The front assembly, well, imagine this pocket is finished. The front assembly is complete. And we'll bring back the back. We need the back assembly back on the table to talk about the shoulder seams. And we'd imagine that the darts are sewn on this side. We just stitched one side. But we'd line up our seams, our shoulder seams, and pin. And that's what we're used to doing, right? And we'd stitch that seam. But we like to add an extra little step. We like to add some clear elastic. And clear elastic is elastic that's clear. And it's really was designed for swimwear. Years ago, we used it in swimwear. And then Nancy, classic time-saving tip from Nancy, decided that would work great in knit shoulder seams to keep them from stretching out. So when you head to the sewing machine to stitch that seam, while you're stitching it, just insert that elastic and then trim off the ends and you're good to go.
Oh, that's a great tip.
The next step in sewing the tunic would be to set the sleeves in. And we have a sleeve here, and I'm imagining that I've stitched this shoulder seam with pins, and it's still flat. If you open this up, the back is attached to the front at the shoulders only. And you see that natural sleeve opening. And then we have our sleeve that we fused to the bottom. Here's our sleeve cap. And to the bottom of the sleeves, we fuse that 1-inch fusible interfacing. And then we press this up. Let's press this up while it's a flat sleeve. Flat construction is the key, right?
Yes.
And we'll use Clover's hot ruler at the ironing board, and we'll press. Just press up 1 inch with steam. This is steam is friendly with the hot ruler, and it's no issue at all to use that steam. Press and then set with your tailor's clapper. So that'll be pre-creased before it's even set into the garment.
Okay.
And I like to do that with a lower hem too.
Oh, sure.
Just deal with the front flat and the back flat and turn up that lower hem at this time. We'll hand that back to you, and we'll turn our sleeve around and we'll insert into the garment. So just match your notches and pin. And you have some pins to pin that one in place.
Sure
and
do.
I'm matching the side seams. And instead of setting in a tube sleeve, say we were to sew that lower seam of the sleeve, we have a tube sleeve, and then to sew that in the round is more difficult than flat construction.
It is. I did a lot of costuming and made a lot of shirts, and a lot of sleeves were taken in and out many times.
It's so much easier when it's flat. So we'd sew that sleeve cap, and that's great for the serger. You could do this step at the serger overlock machine and set that sleeve into place. And then once that's sewn into place, it's still flat. We have a flat sleeve, a flat back, and a flat front. The next step is to bring that back over the front and meet our underarm seams. So this is the sleeve, still flat. Match those underarm seams and then pin all the way down. And you have a couple of things to line up here too with that side inset. That aligns right with that front inset. The back inset and the front inset align. So you could line up that, and I'll pin the sleeve. And that's it. We head to the sewing machine and stitch that underarm seam. One seam stitches the underarm and the side seam of the dress.
What a great technique, just like putting in the pocket, and it's one continuous seam, and you don't have to try to fit something in where you're not sure if that's going to match up or not.
Right, and it's complete. The next step would be to turn up the sleeve hem and turn up the lower hem and top stitch that with a wobble stitch. You could also use your cover stitch. If you have a serger overlock machine with a cover stitch, this would be ideal location for using that stitch. After top stitching or cover stitching your sleeve hems and your lower hem, you'd insert the neck band. The neck is the only opening that's not complete yet. And your darts would be stitched, your side seams would be stitched. And the neckband is so easy. We've really simplified it. It's basically a rectangle of fabric. So that it does have a pattern piece. The neckband has a pattern piece, and it has notches that you want to make sure you cut.
Right.
Because that lines up with the shoulder seams. It's always good to transfer your notches and your markings. It's key. The designer of the pattern, I put those in there to help you out. So it's just a long rectangle, but we need to sew it into a tube. And that one I've already stitched. It's just 5/8 of an inch seam allowance with the wobble stitch again. And then we place it wrong sides together and press. You press this at the ironing board, and then I like to align the seam with the shoulder seam.
Okay.
So this neckband would be stitched, and then you'd place it seam to seam edges to cut edges, matching those notches.
I'm going to share some pins with you.
Thank you. I'm out of pins. Thanks, Stitch It Sister.
You're welcome.
And then you'd pin that in, matching those notches. Once you have that pinned in, you stitch that with a wobble stitch. And we should have pre-pressed this one, but you get the idea. You'd align your seams, match your notches, clip that V to make it a flat open seam, and stitch that neckband to the garment, to the dress in the round. And then when you come back, when you press that open, when you turn this garment right side out, you can see that finished neckband. But we want to top stitch. There's a lot of top stitching details. And to top stitch along that edge, we use the edge stitching foot.
Oh, okay.
That edge stitching or edge joining foot allows for parallel line stitching right along with that well of that seam. So they have perfect top stitching when you use that presser foot. Our McCall's knit dress is a great design, so fun to sew, and so comfortable to wear.
Until now, I was intimidated by sewing welt pockets. This technique is easy.
We hope you've enjoyed the Stitch It Sisters project. You'll find this pattern along with a limited number of bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com.
Be sure to tune in again for another Stitch It Sisters sewing adventure.
In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Bernina, Clover, Riley Blake Designs. OESD, Oklahoma Embroidery Supply and Design. And shopnzp.com.
Bernina, made to create.